magic and explore the most. Stories full of wonder, fantastical delights. Open your eyes and see the parade come to life. Sansy's parade, Sansy's parade. Join the parade, Sansy's parade, parade. Sansy's parade, Sansy's parade. Join the parade, Sansy's parade.
Chapter 13. As he drove the carriage back into the heart of Transylvania, Van Helsing reached the undeniable conclusion: he was changing. His senses of smell and hearing were astonishingly sharp, and he found he could even see small animals at great distances. It was a predator's vision. He had not slept in days now, yet he felt better than he had in his whole life, or at least in the part of it that he could remember. He felt stronger, more energetic, more alive. It would not be long now. Soon he would turn into a monster. He would fight the coming change with everything he had, with every weapon in his personal arsenal, but the curse would soon take him. Until that happened though, he was still a man. He had free will and he could still choose how to spend his last hours. He would save Frankenstein. One of the final acts in his work would not be one of destruction done in the name of God and his church, it would be to preserve innocent life. All of his conflicting duties and loyalties melted away, replaced with a simple desire to help. It would make the Cardinal furious, but that was just a bonus. And then there was Dracula. Van Helsing knew that he had to destroy the vampire to keep Frankenstein and Anna safe. Yes, there was the rest of the world to consider, but Van Helsing found his own world growing very small. He wasn't going to fight this time for the Vatican, or humanity. He would fight so that an innocent man might know peace, so that the little girl who still lived inside the courageous princess might see the ocean and know a few moments of happiness at the sight. Fighting and dying for those things would not bother him a bit. It was late in the afternoon when they approached Castle Frankenstein. He scanned with his predator's eyes and ears. Nothing. There was a scent of corruption in the wind, but it was very faint as he drove the horses at a hard gallop for the last half-mile. When they arrived at the castle, Anna was out of the coach, her sword drawn, before Van Helsing was even on the ground. Carl followed a moment later and gave them small bottles of holy water and crucifixes. It wasn't much, but then again, they really didn't have a plan to begin with. The back door, then? The princess said, a slight smile on her lips. Van Helsing nodded. They walked around to the rear of the castle and found the secret door they had used last time. Even with his new and improved senses, Van Helsing could detect no sign of Dracula, his bride or Frankenstein. They hurried along, Van Helsing and Anna taking the stairs two at a time, with Carl struggling to keep up. A few moments later, all three of them raced into the laboratory together. Van Helsing knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. His nose and ears confirmed his fears even before his eyes registered what they were seeing. The laboratory was empty. The scientific equipment had all been moved, and judging by the mess they had left behind, the Count and his servants had been in quite a hurry. They must have taken all the equipment to Dracula's lab, Van Helsing said, dread creeping into his heart. Then we've lost, Anna said. The words cut like a knife. Even if Dracula didn't act immediately to fulfill his plan, Van Helsing had very little time left before he changed. Dracula cannot bring his children to life until the sun sets. We still have time, Carl said. The princess didn't make any effort to hide her surprise. Time? The sun sets in 2 hours, and we've been searching for him for more than 400 years. Carl was undeterred and his expression was deadly serious when he said, I wasn't around for those 400 years, now, was I? The rays of the sun tried to pry through the clouds hovering over Manor Valerius. They were winning the fight now, but in less than 2 hours, that battle would be lost. Night would descend, perhaps the longest and darkest night the world had ever known. So, what did you learn? Van Helsing asked Carl as they pounded up the stairs of the tower and entered a bedroom that, to Van Helsing, looked as though it had been organized by a librarian. Relics, artifacts, and books were everywhere, arranged in neat piles. That Count Dracula was actually the son of Valerius the Elder, Carl said. Then he looked at Anna pointedly and added, the son of your ancestor. The princess merely shrugged and replied, everybody knows that. What else? Oh, right. Well, it all started in 1462, when Dracula was murdered, Carl said. Does it say who murdered him? Van Helsing asked. Dracula had said that he had known Van Helsing in the past. It was impossible. Or was it? Had Van Helsing somehow been involved in Dracula's death? Had he witnessed the events? Suddenly, Carl seemed to be very close to providing those answers. No, just some vague reference to the left hand of God. The friar opened an elaborately inscribed Latin text. Anyway, according to this, when Dracula died, he made a covenant with the devil and was given new life, Van Helsing guessed out loud. But the only way to sustain that life was by drinking the blood of others, Anna pointed out. Carl was annoyed at the interruption. Are you two going to let me tell the story? Sorry, Van Helsing and Anna said in unison. Your ancestor, having sired this evil creature, went to Rome to seek forgiveness from God, and that's when the bargain was made, Carl continued. Valerius the Elder was to kill Dracula in return for the eternal salvation of his entire family, right down the line, all the way to you, he said, looking at Anna. The princess nodded. But he couldn't do it. As evil as Dracula was, my ancestor could not kill his own son. Carl pointed out some engravings on the artifacts nearby. So he banished Dracula to an icy fortress, sending him through a door from which there was no return. And then the devil gave him wings, Anna said, suddenly understanding. Yes. All right, so where is this door? Van Helsing asked, impatient. The friar shrugged. I don't know, but when the old knight couldn't kill his own son, he left clues so that future generations might do it for him. That must be what my father was looking for in here, clues to the door's location, Anna said. Van Helsing felt an idea rise up. The door. Of course. He rushed out of the room. Racing down the stairs, he flew into the armory to the large map of Transylvania on the wall. Carl and Anna were beside him seconds later. You said your father spent hours staring at this painting, trying to find Dracula's lair. I think you were right, quite literally. Van Helsing checked where the frame met the wall. There was no gap, it was seamlessly molded into the wall. Undeterred, he said, I think this is the door. He just didn't know how to open it. Carl pointed to the painting. Look. A Latin inscription. Maybe it works like that painting in the tower. He started mumbling the inscription. Anna stepped up to Van Helsing. If this was a door, my father would have opened it long ago, she declared. To continue reading, Carl shoved a chair aside and saw that a piece of the painting was missing. I can't finish the inscription. There's a piece missing. Now it all made sense. Van Helsing pulled out the torn piece of painted cloth that the cardinal had given him. Your father didn't have this. Where did you get that? Anna asked. He handed it to Carl. Finish it. The friar placed it inside the missing piece of the map, a perfect match. He finished the inscription, Dum laces at ac in ominbita perire. Van Helsing remembered the cardinal's translation and repeated it. In the name of God, open this door. The painting began to change, starting at the edges and spreading inward. The thick crystal frost washed over the entire image, devouring it until the map disappeared completely. Then the icy exterior began to shimmer and transform until, a few seconds later, they were staring at a large, ancient mirror that had somehow replaced the map. A mirror? Carl wondered out loud. Anna studied it and finally spoke. Dracula has no reflection in a mirror. Why? Asked Van Helsing. Maybe to Dracula, It's not a mirror at all, Anna replied. On impulse, Van Helsing reached out to touch the looking glass, his hand going straight through and vanishing inside. Suddenly his hand went cold, and Van Helsing inhaled sharply. Carl jumped, and together he and Anna said, "What? What?" "It's cold," Van Helsing said, pulling his hand out and showing the others the snowflakes on his palm. "And it's snowing." Grabbing a torch out of a nearby wall sconce, he said, "See you on the other side." "Don't worry, we're behind you. Not right behind you, but behind you," Carl sputtered. Anna grabbed Van Helsing's arm, and for a moment he thought she would try to stop him, but she just said, "Be careful," then let him go. Van Helsing gave her a nod and stepped into the mirror. It was cold and snowing steadily on the other side. He had come out of what looked like another ancient mirror encased in a large black obelisk. Anna stepped through a minute later and stood next to him. Together they looked up at a huge medieval fortress that seemed to have been carved straight out of the black rock that made up the icy mountainous landscape around them. They don't make them like they used to, Van Helsing thought, but then, they had never made them like this. The scale of this castle was enormous, with spires and battlements that dwarfed anything Van Helsing had ever seen. The foundations of the fortress appeared to be rooted in living mountain, the castle's three main towers sprouting from the black rock as if the entire structure had been formed from the stone rather than built. Two bridges that connected the towers high up were the only clear signs that this monstrosity was the work of man and not spewed up by the dark forces of nature. The edifice was both impressive and forbidding, radiating ominous power. "Castle Dracula," Anna announced. Carl was nowhere in sight, but there was no time to wait. Van Helsing started toward the castle. He heard noise behind them and turned to see the friar emerge from the mirror. Carl looked up at the fortress, which had clearly been designed to strike fear in anyone who beheld it. It produced the desired effect, judging from the friar's reaction. He spun around and ran straight back into the mirror. Carl struck it face first and bounced off, landing on his behind. Well, that settled it. The mirror was a one-way ticket. That suited Van Helsing, as he did not have to escape to complete this mission. "Wait up," Carl said, running back toward him and Anna. He gave the princess a look and they proceeded to the castle's door. They would meet this battle head-on. The massive entrance was made of iron, rusted shut, and covered in slippery ice for good measure. The transom above the door was 30 feet up, well out of reach. "Do we have a plan?" "It doesn't have to be Wellington's at Waterloo, but some sort of plan would be nice," Carl said. "We're going to go in there and stop Dracula," Van Helsing replied. "And kill anything that gets in our way," Anna added. Carl backed away. "Let me know how that goes." "There's no time for this," Van Helsing thought, grabbing Carl and Anna by their collars. Before he had time to think about what he was doing, he simply ran up the side of the door. It was vertical and covered with slippery ice. It should have been impossible. But Van Helsing did it anyway. In those few seconds, he relished the sheer power of the werewolf's curse. He carried the princess and the friar right over the transom at the top of the door, then down the other side, controlling their descent so they landed softly on the floor. Anna and Carl appeared to be in shock. He knew how they felt. "Well, as grateful as I am to be out of the cold, that doesn't seem like a good thing," Carl said. Then it started, the pain, sudden and excruciating. Van Helsing bent over as if he were being stretched and twisted from the inside out. "Are you feeling okay?" Anna asked him. An odd sensation came over his face, clouding his vision. Then the fit passed and he was himself again, or as close to it as he would ever likely be again. But he couldn't think about the future now. He had a mission, and one last chance to redeem whatever was left of his soul. They were in a massive foyer with high walls, pillars, and ceilings. Judging from the size of the place, it had not been designed for a man bound by gravity. Covering much of the surface of the interior walls were the cocoons of Dracula's young, Thousands of them, with electric wires sticking into each one. "Oh my God, if he brings all these to life," Anna began. "The world would be a smorgasbord," Carl finished. Noise. Someone was coming. Van Helsing saw Dracula's servant, who Anna had told him was named Igor, appear around a corner carrying a large bundle of wires and electrodes. The twisted little man skidded to a stop and looked stunned when he saw them. "How? How did you?" "It's impossible," he gasped, then quickly regained his composure, dropped everything in his arms, and ran like hell. Van Helsing quickly produced one of his circular saw blades and threw it. The weapon whistled through the air and caught Igor by his sleeve, pinning him to a rock wall. "Please. Please don't kill me," Igor begged as Van Helsing approached him. "Why?" "Well, Igor said meekly, apparently unable to think of a good reason. Neither could Van Helsing. He tore the blade out of the wall and raised it to end the evil creature's life when he heard a familiar sound. Frankenstein was bellowing somewhere nearby. The shouting was coming from right next to Igor, through a window with metal bars. There was movement beyond the barrier, a pulley with chains. Van Helsing stuck a torch through the bars and looked down a shaft cut through the stone of the castle. Far below, Van Helsing saw what could only be a dungeon cell. Inside it and encased in a massive block of ice was Frankenstein, with only the large man's head and neck free. The chains ran through the ice. It was a particularly cruel form of captivity, and Van Helsing could see that Frankenstein was suffering greatly in his frozen prison. A command rang out from above. "Bring me the monster," Dracula's voice echoed. Looking up, Van Helsing saw that the shaft ran perhaps 300 feet up. "My master has awakened," Igor said, a smile on his lips. The pulley started to rise and the chains snapped taut. Within moments, Frankenstein and the block of ice were lifted from the cell floor. Fury overtook Van Helsing. He dropped his torch and began to pull furiously at the thick iron bars. They started to twist, but Van Helsing couldn't break them, even with his werewolf venom-fueled strength. The bars actually started to move slightly, and Anna added to his effort, but it was hopeless. Frankenstein continued to rise and Van Helsing collapsed against the bars, defeated, as the power of his rage seeped away. On his way up the shaft, Frankenstein came eye to eye with Van Helsing, who saw the pain and fear in the large man's eyes, and something else, too, a sense of recognition for Van Helsing's struggle and sympathy. To his surprise, Frankenstein spoke, "There is a cure." Van Helsing was too shocked to answer at first. "What?" he finally sputtered. "Dracula. He has the cure to remove the curse of the werewolf," Frankenstein said. Then the giant was gone, borne upward to meet his destiny. Desperate, Van Helsing stuck his hand through the bars and for one moment touched the block of ice. He caught a last look at Frankenstein. "Go. Find the cure. Save yourself," Frankenstein called out to him. There it was. Frankenstein was a man, not a monster. "I was right to come to save him," Van Helsing told himself. He felt Anna's hands on him, pulling him back. "Come on. You heard him. Let's find it." Van Helsing shook her off. "Something was wrong here. There's one question we haven't asked." "What's that?" Anna asked. "Why does Dracula have a cure?" "I don't care." "I do," Van Helsing replied. He turned to Igor, whose mouth was clamped tight. "Why would he need one?" he asked the twisted creature. Clearly, Igor feared his master's wrath more than he feared Van Helsing. Carl spoke before Van Helsing could act, because the only thing that can kill him is a werewolf. "The painting, that's what it meant," Van Helsing said. "Of course, the battle between the two great knights, who became a vampire and a werewolf. That was the final clue, the last missing piece to their puzzle." "But Dracula has used werewolves to do his bidding for centuries," Anna said. "Yes, but if one ever had their will to turn on him, he'd need a cure to remove the curse and make it human before it bit him," Carl replied. Suddenly Van Helsing had a plan and saw his future clearly. Dracula could be defeated, he alone was the key to the vampire's destruction. Yet even if he somehow survived the now inevitable battle with Dracula, there was still the werewolf's curse to fear. This would most likely be the assignment that Van Helsing would not be returning from. But perhaps the sacrifice would be worth it if it meant vanquishing mankind's greatest enemy. Ultimately, it seemed that his fate now rested in the hands of his extraordinary companions. To Igor he said, "You're going to take these two and lead them to it." "No, I'm not." Van Helsing stuck the blade under Igor's chin, which changed the wretched creature's mind in a hurry. Igor smiled and said, "Yes, I am." Anna grabbed Van Helsing. "Are you insane?" she questioned. He shook his head. "Not quite yet." Carl grabbed Anna and said, "He's right, when the bell begins to toll at midnight, he'll be able to kill Dracula. We just have to find the cure and get it into him before the final stroke." "Are you insane?" Anna asked. "Actually, I've always sort of wondered," Carl replied. Van Helsing pulled a small weapon from his cloak. It was a pair of clippers. He held them in front of Igor. "Every time you hesitate, if they even suspect you're misleading them," turning to Anna, he handed her the weapon, "clip off one of his digits," he told her. "My pleasure. Just make sure to leave him with enough toes to get you there," Van Helsing said. Looking terrified, Igor pointed to two huge spiral staircases. "The stairs on the right, they lead to the Black Tower, that's where it is." "And the stairs on the left?" Igor hesitated, and Van Helsing reached for the clippers. "The Devil's Tower. Devil's Tower. That's where we reassembled the laboratory. Would I lie to you?" "Not if you wanted to live." Turning to Cal, Van Helsing said, "If I'm not cured by the 12th stroke." He took a silver stake from his cloak and handed it to Cal, whose eyes widened. Cal shook his head. "I don't think I could." "You must," Van Helsing pressed. It was a burden he didn't want to inflict on Cal, but if the friar didn't do it, the princess would have to. She could and would do it, but Van Helsing didn't want her to have to pay the price for the act. Carl nodded and took the stake. Grabbing Igor by the scruff of the neck, he pulled the twisted little man toward the stairs. "Come on." Van Helsing looked into Anna's eyes. Time seemed to stand still. Like him, she was scared and preparing herself for whatever she would have to do. He saw something of himself in her eyes, as well as a number of things that were new, exotic, and exciting, things he wanted to know more about. But most of all he saw something worth fighting for. He had found something more important than the search for his own past. "Don't get killed," he told her. She looked up at him, her face filled with conviction for their ultimate goal. "You still don't understand. It doesn't matter what happens to me. We must save my family." Anna started to leave, but he pulled her back. "If you're late, run like hell," he said. She nodded, but he found he couldn't let her go yet. "Don't be late," he said. She smiled and started to move again, but there was one more thing he had to make clear. Van Helsing pulled her to him and kissed her hard, then softly, then hard again. She returned the same passion. The venom in his veins, Dracula's plan for the world, his own unknown past, all was forgotten, and Van Helsing found himself lost in her. Anna surprised him again by doing something he could never have done. She pulled away. She stared at him, her eyes full of promise, and then turned and ran after Kyle. Dracula watched the Dwiggy put the final touches on Victor Frankenstein's equipment. The Frankenstein monster was now not merely bolted but welded into the metal pod and screaming angrily. The Count strode over and said, "What are you complaining about?" As if in response, the entire laboratory sparked to life. Great arcs of electricity shot up and down the walls between the dynamos. The gears kicked in and fan belts snapped taut and began to run. "This is why you were made, to prove that God is not the only one who can create life. Dracula cried out in a tone one would use to explain something to a simple-minded child. Turning a flywheel, the Count raised the monster off of the ground. "And now you will give life to my young." The creature merely yelled in anger and defiance. Typical of the living, incapable of thinking beyond their own petty existence, Dracula mused. The monster didn't understand or care that he was part of a new order that would soon spread through the world. And in its ashes, Dracula would create one fashioned by his will, and in his own image. The Count turned the wheel faster.
I'm glad you enjoyed that video/gameplay. Just remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below. Until next time, goodbye!